Welcome to Mystery Stories, where quiet villages hide extraordinary secrets and every polite smile may conceal a mystery waiting to unfold. Tonight's tale follows Miss Marple as a stranger arrives in a peaceful village, bringing with him whispers of the past, uneasy gossip, and a truth someone is desperate to keep buried. Settle in, relax, and let this cozy mystery guide you gently into a world of suspense, observation, and revelation. Chapter 1. It was Mrs. Carter who first said that something felt different in the village, though she said it in the gentle, uncertain way people used when they feared sounding foolish. The remark came during a bright morning at the bakery, when the smell of warm bread drifted into the lane and conversations lingered longer than errands required. She leaned closer to Mrs. Simpkins and whispered that a stranger had arrived at Rosebank Cottage during the night, and not in the ordinary way visitors usually came, with advance letters, luggage labels, or relatives waiting eagerly at the gate, but quietly, almost cautiously, as though hoping not to be noticed at all. By midday, the news had reached nearly everyone in St. Briarwood, carried effortlessly through polite conversations and cheerful speculation. The village thrived on routine, and any change, however small, created a ripple of interest. Rosebank Cottage itself stood slightly apart from the main road, a neat ivy-covered house belonging to Mrs. Linton, whose fondness for conversation was matched only by her enthusiasm for guests. She had already told 3 separate people that her new lodger was most respectable, though she admitted she knew almost nothing about him. Miss Marple heard the story later that afternoon while visiting the vicarage for tea. She listened quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression mild and attentive. The vicar's wife described the arrival with great animation, explaining that the gentleman had appeared shortly after dusk, carrying only 1 suitcase, and asking whether a room might be available for several weeks. "Such confidence," Mrs. Hayward remarked. "Men rarely travel so lightly unless they expect comfort waiting for them." Miss Marple smiled faintly at this, but said nothing. Instead, she asked whether the gentleman had mentioned business or family in the area. "Oh no," replied Mrs. Hayward, "simply rest and fresh air," though he did seem very interested in who lived where. That detail settled gently into Miss Marple's thoughts. Visitors usually admired the gardens first, or the church tower, or the peaceful silence of the countryside. Interest in residence rather than scenery suggested a different purpose entirely. Later, as tea was poured, another small piece of gossip emerged. Mrs. Carter mentioned that the stranger had introduced himself as Mr. Lane when purchasing cigarettes at the shop that morning. Yet Mrs. Simpkins insisted she had heard Mrs. Linton call him Mr. Allen only hours earlier. The ladies laughed at the confusion, blaming travel fatigue or poor hearing. Names, after all, were easily muddled. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. She had lived long enough to know that genuine mistakes tended to embarrass people. Deliberate ones rarely did. That evening, she chose to walk past Rosebank Cottage on her way home, not out of curiosity, at least not openly, but because the path offered a pleasant view of the sunset. The cottage windows glowed warmly, curtains drawn halfway. Through the garden gate, she glimpsed the stranger standing near the hedge, watching the road. He was not admiring the fading light. His gaze moved carefully from passerby to passerby, attentive in a way that felt almost professional. When a villager greeted him, he smiled politely, but with a delay that suggested calculation rather than friendliness. Miss Marple noticed another detail. His suitcase rested just inside the doorway, still packed, though he had arrived hours earlier. Most guests unpacked quickly, eager to settle. A man prepared to stay rarely kept his belongings ready for departure. Mrs. Linton soon appeared beside him, speaking cheerfully, her voice carrying across the garden. She introduced Miss Marple warmly, and the gentleman bowed slightly. "Mr. Allen," he said. His tone was pleasant, practiced. Miss Marple returned the greeting kindly, observing the faint tightening around his eyes as he studied her in return. People often underestimated elderly ladies. This man did not. He assessed her carefully, as though measuring whether she noticed more than she appeared to. His shoes caught her attention next. They were polished yet marked with dark clay unfamiliar to village paths. The soil around St. Briarwood was pale and chalky, but this mud was heavy and almost black. "You must enjoy walking," she remarked gently. "Yes," he replied quickly, then added, "though I have not explored much yet." The contradiction was small but clear. Mrs. Linton chattered happily about the upcoming church luncheon, explaining every detail while the stranger listened with polite interest. Yet Miss Marple noticed he asked precise questions. Who organized the event? Which families attended regularly? Whether newcomers were common? Not social curiosity. Information gathering. As dusk deepened, Miss Marple excused herself and continued home, her thoughts moving quietly through each observation like pieces of embroidery arranged into pattern, though she would never have described it that way aloud. She simply considered people, as she always had, comparing behavior to countless memories stored across years of village life. The next morning brought fresh discussion at the post office. The stranger, it seemed, had entered briefly but refused both letters and telegram services. He asked only for directions before leaving abruptly. "That's the odd part," the postmistress confided later. "Most visitors are delighted to receive post." He behaved as though avoiding it. Avoiding communication suggested either secrecy or fear of discovery. Miss Marple thanked her kindly and purchased stamps she did not immediately need, lingering just long enough to observe reactions around her. By afternoon, another remark surfaced. The butcher's boy claimed the stranger had been seen studying the church notice board for nearly 10 minutes without reading a single announcement. Instead, he watched reflections in the glass behind him. Miss Marple found this particularly interesting. People watched reflections when they wished to see who approached unnoticed. That evening she again passed Rosebank Cottage. The curtains were closed earlier than before. As she paused near the gate, Mrs. Linton's voice drifted through an open window. "He locks his door even when stepping into the garden," the widow complained to a neighbor. "Such caution. I told him nothing ever happens here." Miss Marple continued walking, though her mind lingered on the remark. Excessive caution in peaceful surroundings often meant danger existed elsewhere, either behind or ahead. The village itself remained cheerful. Preparations for the luncheon filled conversations, flowers were arranged, cakes planned, and seating debated with cheerful seriousness. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, Miss Marple sensed a subtle tension spreading, like a faint chill before rain. 2 days later, she encountered the stranger again near the green. This time, he greeted her first. "Beautiful village," he said. "Yes," she replied. "It encourages honesty. People tend to become exactly who they are here." For a moment, his composure faltered. Only briefly, but enough. He smiled again, though more carefully, and excused himself soon afterward. Miss Marple watched him walk away, noting how he glanced behind him twice before turning the corner. Not fear exactly. Expectation. Someone either searched for him, or he searched for someone else. That night, while enjoying her supper, she reflected on the changing names, the packed suitcase, the avoidance of post, the attentive questions, and the careful observation of villagers. Each detail alone meant little. Together, they formed a quiet pattern of disguise and purpose. A man did not arrive anonymously in a small village unless anonymity mattered deeply. Outside, church bells marked the hour, their sound calm and reassuring. St. Briarwood settled into sleep, unaware that its peaceful routines had already begun to shift. Miss Marple set aside her teacup and allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. Villages, she often believed, revealed truth more quickly than cities because people noticed differences instinctively, even when they pretended not to. And somewhere within those differences lay intention. She wondered why a man would introduce himself by 2 names within a single day. Not absent-mindedness, no. The stranger possessed far too much control for that. It suggested preparation, perhaps even rehearsal, which meant he expected questions, which meant he anticipated discovery. And as Miss Marple extinguished the lamp and prepared for bed, she felt the faint but unmistakable sensation that St. Briarwood had already welcomed not merely a guest, but a story unfolding quietly behind polite smiles. For a man who arrived seeking peace rarely watched every doorway, and a man who feared letters often carried secrets already written elsewhere. Miss Marple, smiling gently to herself in the darkness, wondered which name truly belonged to the stranger at Rosebank Cottage, and whether the village had just opened its door to trouble that had traveled a very long way to find them. Chapter 2. Mrs. Simpkins declared, with great certainty and very little evidence, that strangers always brought excitement to St. Briarwood, though whether the excitement proved pleasant or troublesome depended entirely upon how politely they drank tea. The statement was made during a small afternoon gathering at the vicarage, where lemon cake had been served in generous slices, and conversation moved comfortably between weather, parish matters, and the increasingly fascinating subject of Mrs. Linton's mysterious lodger. Miss Marple sat near the window, where sunlight rested gently upon the carpet, listening more than speaking, as she so often did. The ladies discussed the gentleman with cheerful curiosity, yet beneath their laughter lingered an unmistakable unease. Villages possessed an instinct for imbalance, and the arrival of someone who did not quite fit created a disturbance, felt rather than understood. He attended the grocer's this morning, Mrs. Carter announced. Asked questions about families, old families especially. Quite serious questions, too. Perhaps he is writing a book, suggested Mrs. Hayward hopefully. Miss Marple smiled faintly, but noticed how Mrs. Carter hesitated before replying. No, she said slowly. Writers usually look distracted. This one listens too carefully. The distinction pleased Miss Marple. Careful listening often revealed intention. As tea was poured, another piece of gossip emerged. Mrs. Finch, wife of the wealthy businessman Harold Finch, mentioned casually that the stranger had been seen walking beside her husband near the churchyard the previous evening. Their conversation, she said, appeared tense, though conducted in hushed tones. My husband insisted it was nothing, she added quickly, though her voice carried the faint strain of someone unconvinced. Miss Marple observed the slight tremor in Mrs. Finch's hand as she lifted her cup. Not fear exactly, worry mixed with embarrassment, as though an unpleasant memory had resurfaced unexpectedly. And your husband knew the gentleman? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Finch hesitated. He said they had never met. The pause before answering lasted just a moment too long. Miss Marple lowered her eyes politely, hiding the quiet spark of interest that had awakened within her thoughts. After tea, she chose a longer path home, one that passed near the churchyard. The afternoon air carried the scent of damp grass, and the silence felt unusually watchful. Near the stone wall, she noticed footprints pressed deeply into the soil, 2 sets, facing one another for some time rather than passing by. One pair belonged to heavy walking shoes she now recognized as the stranger's. Arguments left shapes behind even after voices faded. Later that evening, Miss Marple visited the small shop to purchase thread she scarcely required. The shopkeeper eagerly supplied further information. He asked about property ownership, the woman whispered. Which houses belonged to which families, and how long they had lived here. Curious questions for a holiday visitor. Indeed, Miss Marple thought. Visitors admired roses or countryside views. Investigators asked about ownership. As she stepped outside, she saw the stranger standing across the green, studying the war memorial. Yet his gaze shifted repeatedly toward Harold Finch's office windows. When Finch himself emerged moments later, the stranger approached him immediately. Their exchange appeared polite, even friendly to distant observers. But Miss Marple noticed Finch's shoulders stiffen, and his smile remained fixed long after amusement should have faded. The stranger spoke quietly, leaning slightly forward, while Finch glanced around to ensure no one listened. Miss Marple turned away before they noticed her watching. One learned far more by appearing uninterested. The following morning brought another small inconsistency. At the bakery, Mrs. Linton complained affectionately that her lodgers seemed restless, leaving early and returning late, often with mud upon his shoes despite dry weather. Exploring, she said proudly. Such energy. Miss Marple remembered the dark soil she had seen before and wondered again where precisely those walks led. Shortly afterward, the baker added an observation of his own. The stranger had purchased several envelopes the previous day but declined stamps, saying he preferred to acquire them elsewhere. A tiny detail, easily forgotten by most. Yet letters without stamps suggested intention to send them from another village, perhaps to avoid recognition of origin. Miss Marple carried her bread home slowly, thoughts arranging themselves with quiet patience. That afternoon, preparations for the church luncheon intensified, drawing villagers together in cheerful cooperation. The stranger appeared unexpectedly to offer assistance, charming several ladies with polite manners. He carried chairs, arranged flowers, and listened attentively to conversations. Too attentively. Miss Marple noticed he encouraged others to speak while revealing little about himself. Each question he asked built a clearer understanding of village relationships. Who trusted whom, who owed money, who argued quietly behind closed doors. At one moment, he mentioned an incident involving a business collapse many years earlier in a nearby town. Harold Finch, standing nearby, dropped a spoon with a sharp clatter. The room fell briefly silent. Finch laughed too loudly. "Ancient history," he said quickly. The stranger merely smiled. Miss Marple observed the exchange carefully. Surprise alone did not cause such discomfort. Recognition did. Later, while arranging tablecloths, Miss Marple found herself beside Mrs. Linton. "Such a thoughtful gentleman," the widow said warmly, "though he sleeps poorly. I heard him pacing last night." "New places often disturb rest," Miss Marple replied. "Yes, though he locked his door again even while fetching water downstairs." "Imagine feeling unsafe here." Miss Marple agreed softly, though privately she suspected the lock protected not against danger outside, but discovery inside. As evening approached, a subtle change settled over the village. Harold Finch left the hall early, offering vague excuses. The stranger watched him depart with calm patience, as though waiting for precisely that moment. Miss Marple noticed something else then, a look not of hostility but satisfaction. A person satisfied had achieved confirmation. Walking home later, Miss Marple passed the churchyard once more. Voices drifted from behind the yew trees. She recognized Finch's anxious tone and the stranger's quieter reply. "I only want the truth," the stranger said. "You should leave," Finch answered sharply. "You don't understand what you're stirring." Miss Marple moved away before hearing more, her presence unnoticed. She felt no need to intrude further. Enough had already been revealed. Truth rarely arrived gently. It tended to follow unfinished business. That night, as lamps glowed warmly across St. Briarwood, Miss Marple reflected upon the accumulating details, changing names, avoided letters, private conversations, questions about property and past scandals. The stranger was not hiding from the village. He was searching within it, and Harold Finch, respectable and prosperous, appeared increasingly uneasy under that search. Miss Marple poured herself a final cup of tea and considered how often the past returned, disguised as coincidence. Villages remembered quietly, even when individuals preferred forgetting. Somewhere, years earlier, a story had begun that had not yet finished. Outside, footsteps sounded briefly along the lane, hurried and purposeful. Miss Marple glanced toward the window, but saw only shadows moving beyond the hedge. She wondered whether the stranger had come to uncover wrongdoing, or to settle it. And as she set down her cup, one thought settled firmly in her mind. A man does not question a village so carefully unless he already knows where the answers lie. Miss Marple, gazing thoughtfully into the dim light, suspected that the newcomer's interest in Harold Finch was far from accidental, and that whatever bound them together had begun long before either man arrived in St. Briarwood. Chapter 3. The first person to mention the light was the baker's boy, and he did so with the hesitant excitement of someone unsure whether he had witnessed something important or merely imagined it. He told Mrs. Carter early that morning that a lantern had been moving behind Rosebank Cottage long after midnight, swaying slowly near the hedgerow as though someone searched the ground for something lost. By breakfast, the story had traveled across half the village, acquiring small embellishments along the way, yet the essential detail remained unchanged. Someone had been awake when St. Briarwood slept. Miss Marple heard the account while selecting apples at the grocer's. She listened quietly, asking only whether the lantern moved steadily or paused often. "Oh, it stopped several times," the boy insisted, like someone thinking where to look next. Miss Marple thanked him gently and continued her shopping, though her thoughts lingered on the image. Searching required purpose. Wandering did not. The morning air felt unusually heavy as she walked toward the green. A faint mist clung to the hedges, softening familiar shapes. Outside Rosebank Cottage, Mrs. Linton stood speaking animatedly to a neighbor, her voice carrying both pride and mild complaint. "He barely slept," she said, "up and down the stairs all night. And such nerves this morning. Nearly dropped his tea tray." Miss Marple approached with polite greetings, noting how Mrs. Linton lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Mr. Allen, or Lane, as someone insists, seems quite unsettled today. Said he had much on his mind." Miss Marple expressed sympathetic concern. Travel fatigue, she suggested gently, often revealed itself after arrival rather than before. Yet when the stranger emerged from the cottage moments later, she saw something quite different from fatigue. His expression was alert, almost strained, and faint shadows rested beneath his eyes. More telling still was the way he scanned the road before stepping through the gate, as though expecting interruption. He greeted Miss Marple courteously, though his smile appeared carefully constructed. "Restless night?" she asked kindly. "One grows unused to silence," he replied. An interesting answer, she thought. Most visitors praised village quiet, only those accustomed to tension found peace unsettling. As he walked away, she noticed faint smudges along his cuff, dark ink, hastily wiped, but not entirely removed. Writing late at night, then. Perhaps letters. The thought settled comfortably among her growing collection of observations. Later that morning, a new rumor spread. Someone had attempted to enter Harold Finch's office during the night. The door showed slight damage near the lock, though nothing appeared stolen. Finch himself dismissed the matter publicly, laughing it away as youthful mischief. Miss Marple, however, noticed that he avoided eye contact while telling the story outside the post office. His laughter arrived too quickly and ended too abruptly. Fear disguised as annoyance was rarely convincing. Inside the post office, the postmistress shared another curious detail. The stranger had visited briefly again, asking about delivery routes to neighboring villages rather than local services. He seemed most interested in when outgoing mail left for Brenton Hollow, she said. Odd thing to ask unless one planned to send something privately. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A person wishing correspondence unseen often chose distance over convenience. By afternoon, preparations for the church luncheon resumed, filling the hall with cheerful noise. The stranger arrived unexpectedly, offering assistance once more. Yet Miss Marple observed a subtle change in him. He listened less and watched more, particularly whenever Harold Finch entered the room. At one point, Finch crossed near him carrying documents. The stranger spoke quietly, too softly for others to hear. Finch froze mid-step, color draining slightly from his face. "Not here," Finch murmured sharply. The stranger inclined his head and stepped back, expression calm. Miss Marple pretended interest in arranging flowers while noting every movement. Conversations concealed more truth than arguments. Polite restraint required effort, and effort revealed strain. A small domestic clue soon followed. While helping set tables, Miss Marple noticed the stranger examining a parish directory listing village residents and addresses. His finger paused beside Finch's name longer than necessary. Not curiosity. Confirmation. As evening approached, Miss Marple chose to walk again near Rosebank Cottage. The garden appeared undisturbed, yet faint impressions marked the soil near the hedge, shallow depressions as though something had been buried temporarily and then removed. She bent slightly, adjusting her glove, allowing herself a closer look. The earth there was darker than surrounding ground, recently disturbed. The lantern suddenly seemed less mysterious. That night, shortly after dusk, Miss Marple sat by her window with a book resting unopened in her lap. The village quieted gradually, lamps extinguishing one by one. Then, near midnight, she noticed movement along the lane. A figure walked quickly toward the cottage carrying no light at all. Moments later, a faint glow appeared behind the hedge, the lantern again. She did not watch long. Observation, she believed, required restraint as much as attention. Enough had already been seen. The following morning brought visible tension throughout St. Briarwood. Harold Finch canceled 2 business appointments, claiming illness. Mrs. Finch confided anxiously to several ladies that her husband slept poorly and refused breakfast. Meanwhile, the stranger appeared composed once more, though quieter than before. At the bakery, he purchased additional envelopes. "No stamps today either?" the baker asked casually. "I prefer sending letters elsewhere," he replied. Miss Marple, standing nearby, noticed how quickly he realized she had overheard. A brief flicker of caution crossed his face. "Travel habits?" he added lightly. "Quite understandable," she said kindly, though privately she reflected that habits formed for reasons. Later, during afternoon tea at the vicarage, conversation returned inevitably to the stranger. Mrs. Carter mentioned seeing him walking toward the quarry road at dawn, a lonely path seldom used. Miss Marple recalled the dark soil upon his shoes. Quarry earth. Another small piece settled neatly into place. As twilight deepened, she encountered Harold Finch leaving his office. He appeared startled upon seeing her, forcing a smile that failed to reach his eyes. "Busy times?" he muttered. "Yes," she replied gently. Though worries often grow heavier when carried alone, for a moment he looked as though he might speak further. Instead, he nodded stiffly and hurried away. Fear again. Not of strangers, she thought, but of recognition. That evening, Miss Marple considered everything she had learned. The stranger searched for something hidden, wrote letters secretly, and met Finch privately under strain. Someone had attempted entry into Finch's office shortly after a midnight search behind the cottage. Events were no longer separate coincidences. They formed a sequence. A search, a confrontation, preparation for revelation. She poured herself tea and reflected upon human nature, remembering countless village disputes born from old grievances. The past rarely vanished. It waited patiently for opportunity. Outside, wind stirred the hedges softly. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed sharply. Miss Marple felt certain now that the stranger was not merely visiting St. Briarwood. He was gathering proof. And proof suggested accusations soon to follow. As she extinguished her lamp, one quiet realization settled firmly within her thoughts. Someone in the village feared what the stranger might reveal, enough to watch him closely, enough perhaps to act before truth emerged. Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully, sensing that events were moving towards something unavoidable. For when letters are written in secret and lanterns search the earth at midnight, it is rarely peace that follows, but the beginning of consequences long delayed. Chapter 4. The church luncheon began, as such gatherings always did in St. Briarwood, with cheerful confusion disguised as careful organization. Chairs scraped softly across the parish hall floor, flowers were adjusted and readjusted, and polite disagreements about table placement carried the comforting rhythm of long familiarity. Yet beneath the pleasant bustle ran an undercurrent of anticipation, as though everyone sensed that something unspoken hovered just beyond ordinary conversation. Mrs. Carter whispered to Mrs. Simpkins near the entrance that both Harold Finch and the stranger had arrived early, each pretending surprise at seeing the other. The remark traveled quickly, softened by smiles yet sharpened by curiosity. Miss Marple, arranging teaspoons beside delicate china cups, listened without appearing to do so, her attention drifting gently between voices, movements, and silences. The stranger stood near the window, speaking politely with the vicar, his posture relaxed, but his eyes attentive. He watched people in brief, careful glances, noting entrances and exits rather than decorations. Harold Finch, meanwhile, lingered near the far table, speaking loudly to several guests yet glancing repeatedly toward the stranger as though unable to prevent himself. Miss Marple noticed how Finch laughed a fraction too late at jokes and held his teacup too tightly, the porcelain trembling faintly against its saucer. Fear often revealed itself through the hands long before it reached the voice. As the luncheon settled into comfortable chatter, the stranger moved easily among the guests, offering compliments and asking questions that appeared harmless. Yet Miss Marple recognized their precision. He asked about families who had lived in St. Briarwood for decades, about businesses that had changed ownership, about events long forgotten by most but remembered clearly by those who had witnessed them. At one table, he spoke with Mrs. Hayward about village history. "Such a peaceful place," he said warmly. "I imagine very little scandal has ever touched it." Mrs. Hayward laughed. "Oh, every village has its stories. Though we prefer not to dwell on unpleasantness, unpleasantness rarely disappears," he replied gently. "It simply waits." Miss Marple, seated nearby, observed Harold Finch stiffen noticeably at those words, though they were spoken across the room. A small detail, but meaningful. Moments later, an accidental revelation arrived. The stranger mentioned a town several miles away, recalling a business collapse that had occurred many years earlier. The name alone caused Finch's spoon to slip from his hand, striking the plate with a sharp, unmistakable sound. Conversation faltered. Finch bent quickly to retrieve it, laughing awkwardly. "Clumsy of me," he said. "Ancient matters, nothing more." But Miss Marple noticed the color draining from his face and the way his gaze avoided the stranger entirely afterward. Recognition again. Not surprise. Throughout the meal, Miss Marple quietly observed subtle exchanges. Finch drank more wine than usual. The stranger remained calm, almost patient, as though waiting for the correct moment rather than forcing one. Patience suggested preparation. While helping serve dessert, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Linton confiding happily to another guest. "My lodger receives visitors, you know," she said. "Very discreet ones. Only when no one is about. Such mysterious business." Miss Marple asked mildly whether these visitors were acquaintances. "Oh, I never see them clearly," Mrs. Linton admitted. "But voices sometimes. Serious conversations. Visitors arriving secretly rarely brought pleasant news." Soon afterward, Miss Marple noticed the stranger standing alone beside a display of parish photographs. He studied one image intently, an old group portrait taken decades earlier at a charity fair. His attention lingered on a younger Harold Finch standing beside another man whose face had faded slightly with time. Miss Marple approached quietly. "Memories can be troublesome things," she remarked gently. The stranger turned, startled only briefly before smiling. "They are often incomplete. Or perhaps," she said softly, "remembered differently by those involved." For a moment, silence stretched between them. His expression suggested he considered whether she understood more than she appeared to. Then he inclined his head politely and moved away. Miss Marple remained before the photograph, studying the faded companion beside Finch. The resemblance was faint yet present, not to the stranger exactly, but enough to suggest connection. Family resemblance often survived generations. The luncheon continued, laughter returning gradually, though tension lingered beneath conversation like distant thunder. Finch excused himself early once again, claiming urgent business. The stranger watched him leave with quiet satisfaction, neither pursuing nor stopping him. Confirmation achieved, Miss Marple thought. Later, while collecting plates, she noticed another small domestic clue. A folded napkin lay abandoned at Finch's seat, marked faintly by ink smudges along its edge, as though someone had handled documents shortly before dining. Finch had arrived carrying papers despite claiming leisure. Important papers. Perhaps contested ones. Outside the hall, Miss Marple paused briefly near the garden path and overheard hurried voices beyond the hedge. Finch spoke first, his tone strained. "You must stop this," he said sharply. "I only seek honesty," the stranger replied calmly. "You will ruin everything. Truth rarely ruins what is innocent." Miss Marple walked on quietly, leaving them unaware of her presence. She needed no further words. Tone alone conveyed meaning. The stranger was not threatening Finch. He was confronting him. As evening approached, clouds gathered low over the village, dimming the golden light. Miss Marple returned home slowly, considering the day's revelations. The stranger possessed knowledge of Finch's past, knowledge strong enough to provoke fear. Secret visitors suggested investigation rather than escape, and Finch behaved like a man awaiting exposure. Later that night, Mrs. Carter visited briefly with fresh gossip. "Mrs. Linton says her lodger spent the afternoon writing letters," she whispered eagerly. "Pages and pages. Then sealed them carefully and hid them inside his case." Miss Marple thanked her kindly and closed the door afterward, her thoughts settling into clearer order. Letters written in urgency often meant evidence prepared in advance, insurance against danger. She sat by the fire, reflecting upon human nature. People rarely feared lies being uncovered, they feared truths already known. Outside, wind stirred the trees, carrying distant footsteps along the lane. Somewhere a gate closed quickly, followed by silence. Miss Marple sensed events moving closer to resolution, though not yet to safety. The stranger had come with purpose, gathering information piece by piece, pressing gently upon old wounds, and someone, she felt certain, would soon decide that patience had become too dangerous. She poured herself tea and gazed thoughtfully into the fading light. A visitor who arrives seeking answers often believes truth will bring peace. Yet truth, once awakened, unsettles everyone it touches. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly, understanding now that the newcomer had not come to hide from danger at all. He had come to uncover it. And somewhere within St. Briarwood, someone had begun to realize that their past was no longer safely buried, and might soon take desperate steps to keep it that way. Chapter 5. The storm arrived just after noon, rolling across St. Briarwood with unexpected urgency, as though the sky itself had grown impatient with the village's quiet restraint. Wind bent the hedgerows and sent loose petals spinning along the lane, while villagers hurried indoors carrying baskets and folded coats over their heads. It was the sort of weather that unsettled routine, and Miss Marple had long believed that disruptions of habit often invited revelations. The first alarming news came from Mrs. Linton, who appeared at the vicarage flushed with excitement and distress in equal measure. She announced breathlessly that her lodger had gone out during the rising storm and had not returned. His room, she explained, remained strangely orderly, payment left neatly upon the dressing table, yet several personal papers were missing. "He simply vanished," she declared, "without even taking luncheon." The ladies gathered around her responded with eager concern. Disappearances were rare in St. Briarwood. Departures were usually accompanied by polite farewells and promises to write. Miss Marple listened quietly, noting the particular detail that the stranger had left money behind. A man fleeing trouble seldom paused to settle accounts unless he wished to avoid pursuit. "When did you last see him?" Miss Marple asked gently. Shortly before the rain began, Mrs. Linton replied. "He seemed hurried, quite unlike himself. And nervous, too." Nervousness suggested urgency rather than guilt. Outside, rain began striking the windows in steady sheets. Through the blurred glass, Miss Marple watched villagers moving quickly along the road, their figures distorted by weather and speculation alike. By mid-afternoon, another piece of gossip arrived. The butcher's assistant claimed he had seen the stranger running toward the old quarry road, coat unfastened despite the rain. The word running spread rapidly, transforming curiosity into suspicion. Running implied fear or pursuit. Miss Marple considered the timing carefully. The storm would erase footprints quickly. Anyone wishing movements concealed might choose such weather deliberately. As evening approached, the true shock reached the village. Harold Finch had been found dead in his study. The announcement came quietly at first, carried by the doctor's carriage arriving too late to offer help. Soon whispers filled every corner of St. Briarwood. Finch, it seemed, had suffered a fatal fall, discovered beside his writing desk. A broken clock lay nearby, stopped at 20 minutes past 4. Terrible accident, some said immediately, but others spoke more cautiously. Miss Marple received the news with calm composure, though her thoughts sharpened instantly. Timing mattered greatly in such situations, and already the village narrative had begun forming without evidence. By evening, suspicion settled firmly upon the missing stranger. The reasoning appeared simple enough. He argued with Finch, disappeared during a storm, and was seen running shortly before the death was discovered. Simple explanations often proved comforting, and dangerously incomplete. Miss Marple walked slowly toward Finch's house later that evening, joining small groups gathered respectfully outside. Lamps glowed behind drawn curtains, while murmured conversations filled the damp air. Mrs. Carter approached her at once. "They say there were signs of struggle," she whispered. A chair overturned. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Struggles left stories within rooms, though not always the ones assumed. Inside, she was greeted politely by the vicar's wife, who described the scene in hushed tones. Papers scattered across the desk, a broken clock, and an open window despite the storm. An open window during heavy rain struck Miss Marple as particularly curious. Most people closed windows instinctively at the first sign of bad weather. Carelessness did not suit Harold Finch's orderly nature. She asked gently whether anything appeared missing. "No," came the reply, though one photograph from his desk cannot be found. A missing photograph suggested motive far more personal than theft. Miss Marple remained only briefly, offering condolences before leaving. She preferred reflection to intrusion. Outside, the storm had weakened to a steady drizzle. The lane glistened beneath lamplight as she walked home slowly, replaying events in careful order. The stranger ran toward the quarry road before the body was discovered. The clock stopped at 20 minutes past 4. Witnesses placed the stranger running closer to 4 o'clock. A discrepancy. She paused beneath a tree, considering quietly. If the clock marked the true moment of death, then the stranger had fled before the incident occurred, which meant he could not have caused it. Such a simple detail, yet overlooked by nearly everyone already convinced of his guilt. The following morning confirmed her suspicion. Mrs. Simpkins insisted she had seen the stranger pass the green at precisely 10 minutes to 4, hurrying quickly with his suitcase. Miss Marple asked casually whether he appeared frightened. "Oh yes," Mrs. Simpkins replied, kept looking behind him. Fear of pursuit again, not the calm departure of a murderer. Later, while visiting Mrs. Linton to offer comfort, Miss Marple examined the guest's abandoned room with polite discretion. Everything appeared tidy, yet she noticed a faint outline upon the desk, where papers had recently rested, documents removed carefully but in haste. Inside the wastebasket lay a torn scrap of envelope, bearing only partial handwriting. Proof enclosed. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the words. Proof suggested accusation. The stranger had been preparing evidence. Mrs. Linton spoke anxiously behind her. "Do you think he killed Mr. Finch?" Miss Marple answered gently. People who plan wrongdoing rarely leave payment and tidy rooms behind. The widow seemed reassured, though confusion remained. Before leaving, Miss Marple noticed another small detail. Muddy footprints near the back door leading inward, smaller than the stranger's shoes. Someone else had visited recently. Outside, village opinion had already hardened. Conversations at the shop framed the stranger as dangerous, his secrecy now interpreted as guilt rather than caution. Miss Marple listened patiently, but said little. Villages often preferred certainty over truth. That afternoon, she visited the green where children played again, as though nothing had changed. Peace returned quickly on the surface, yet beneath it tension lingered. She considered the missing photograph, the forged simplicity of the accident, the stranger's hurried departure, and the stopped clock. Someone had benefited from his disappearance, someone who remained safely within the village, untouched by suspicion. As dusk approached, she sat by her window with tea growing slowly cool in her hands. Rain clouds drifted away, leaving the air unusually still. The stranger had come seeking truth. Finch had feared exposure. And now, Finch was dead, while suspicion conveniently followed the outsider who could no longer defend himself. Miss Marple felt certain the sequence was no coincidence. She smiled faintly, though sadness touched her expression. Human nature, she reflected, rarely changed. When danger threatened, people often chose the explanation that required the least discomfort. Blaming a stranger was easier than questioning a neighbor. Outside, footsteps passed along the lane. Voices lowered as villagers discussed the tragedy once more. The story had already begun settling into accepted form. But Miss Marple knew stories too well to trust their first telling. She placed her teacup aside and gazed thoughtfully into the gathering twilight. For the man everyone believed had run away from murder, she suspected, had actually been running from something else entirely. And somewhere nearby, the true killer was still moving calmly through familiar rooms, pouring tea, accepting sympathy, and waiting for suspicion to fade. Chapter 6. It was Mrs. Hayward who first remarked that grief in St. Briarwood seemed unusually orderly, and she said it with the quiet discomfort of someone who sensed something improper but could not quite name it. Harold Finch's death had settled over the village like a carefully folded blanket. Respectful, subdued, and strangely controlled. Curtains were drawn, voices softened, and condolences delivered with practiced gentleness. Yet beneath the politeness ran a restless curiosity that refused to fade. Miss Marple noticed it immediately during the morning gathering at the bakery. Conversations paused when she entered, then resumed with renewed energy, each villager offering small fragments of information as though assembling a puzzle none fully understood. "They say Mr. Finch had worries," Mrs. Carter whispered. "Financial matters, perhaps." "Nonsense," replied another. "He was the wealthiest man here." Miss Marple selected her bread thoughtfully. Wealth, she knew, often concealed difficulty rather than prevented it. A new detail emerged as she listened. For several years, Finch had made regular payments through the bank to an unnamed recipient. The information came from the bank clerk's sister, which made it both unofficial and irresistibly persuasive. "Charity, perhaps," Mrs. Simpkins suggested. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Charity rarely required secrecy. She walked home slowly, reflecting on the idea of payments made quietly over many years. Such arrangements usually indicated obligation or fear. Later that afternoon, she visited the vicarage, where Mrs. Hayward shared another memory prompted by recent events. "Harold Finch once had a business partner," she said thoughtfully. "Many years ago. Edward Hale, I believe. A dreadful situation, the partnership collapsed, and the poor man disappeared afterward. Ruined completely." Miss Marple listened closely. Disappearances had a way of echoing through time. "Was the matter ever resolved?" she asked. "Oh, no," Mrs. Hayward replied. "People simply stopped speaking of it. Forgotten publicly, remembered privately, a familiar village pattern." As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple passed the notice board outside the church and paused before an old charity photograph displayed there temporarily for the luncheon. She studied the faded faces again. Harold Finch stood confidently near the center, younger and smiling. Beside him was Edward Hale. The resemblance struck her more clearly now, not between Hale and Finch, but between Hale and the stranger who had called himself Mr. Lane, or Mr. Allen. The shape of the jaw, the thoughtful eyes, family resemblance softened by years, yet unmistakable once seen. Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty settle within her thoughts. The stranger had not arrived randomly. He had come with history. That evening she visited the post office again, where the postmistress greeted her eagerly. "Such terrible business," the woman said. "Though something curious has come to light. Letters redirected recently, addressed to Mr. Finch under initials rather than his name." "Redirected from where?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Brenton Hollow, the very village from which the stranger had wished to send mail." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped outside, her mind arranging facts into clearer order. The stranger had written letters containing proof, likely sending copies elsewhere for safety. He had investigated Finch quietly, confirming suspicions before confronting him, which meant his purpose had been justice, not violence. As she walked toward Finch's house to pay respects, she encountered Clara Finch, Harold's niece and sole remaining relative in residence. Clara greeted her politely, dressed in appropriate mourning, her composure flawless. Too flawless. Miss Marple noticed the young woman's eyes remained dry, despite receiving sympathy from nearly everyone she met. Grief manifested differently in each person, of course, yet Clara's responses felt rehearsed, delivered with precise timing rather than emotion. "You must find this terribly difficult," Miss Marple said kindly. "Yes," Clara replied at once. "Unimaginable." Her tone matched expectation perfectly, yet lacked weight. Inside the house, Miss Marple observed small domestic details others ignored. Papers had been organized unusually quickly, drawers closed too neatly. The study, though recently the scene of tragedy, appeared carefully restored. Someone had tidied more than necessary. While speaking softly with Clara, Miss Marple noticed faint discoloration upon the young woman's fingers, dark ink stains imperfectly washed away. "Have you been writing many letters?" she asked gently. "Only responses to condolences," Clara answered, her voice tightening slightly. A subtle change in tone. Miss Marple smiled kindly, saying nothing further. Later, the maid mentioned casually that Miss Clara had spent considerable time in the study on the afternoon of the death, organizing documents for her uncle. An interesting detail, especially since the stranger had also been investigating those same documents. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she paused near the study window. The latch appeared worn, slightly loose, easily opened from outside, or staged to appear so. She remembered the stormy afternoon and the open window described earlier. A convenient explanation. Perhaps too convenient. Walking home, Miss Marple reflected upon jealousy and inheritance, two motives far older than scandal itself. Clara stood to inherit Finch's entire estate. If old financial wrongdoing surfaced, particularly involving fraud connected to Edward Hale, that inheritance might vanish entirely. The stranger's arrival threatened not only Finch's reputation, but Clara's future. That evening, Mrs. Carter arrived with fresh gossip. "They say the stranger was Edward Hale's son," she whispered excitedly. "Someone recognized him from years ago." Miss Marple nodded gently, unsurprised. The truth moved slowly but steadily through villages, carried by memory rather than evidence. Now the pieces aligned clearly: Hale ruined long ago, Finch prospering afterward, secret payments suggesting guilt, and a son arriving quietly to uncover what truly happened. Revenge, perhaps, but conducted through proof rather than violence. Miss Marple poured tea for her visitor, her thoughts calm but resolute. Someone had used the stranger's investigation as opportunity. An outsider made a perfect suspect. Later, alone by the fire, she reviewed each observation carefully. Clara's composure, ink-stained fingers, knowledge of the study, rapid organization of papers, and eagerness among villagers to blame the missing guest. Human nature again followed familiar patterns. Fear of scandal often inspired desperate choices. Outside, evening bells rang softly across St. Briarwood. their sound peaceful despite the unrest beneath village life. Miss Marple felt certain now that revenge had indeed arrived in the village, but not in the form everyone imagined. The stranger had come seeking justice for his father. Someone else had seized the moment to commit murder. She folded her hands thoughtfully, sensing the truth drawing closer, though not yet ready to reveal itself openly. For the most dangerous person in any mystery, she reflected quietly, was rarely the one who ran away. It was often the one who remained behind, calm, sympathetic, and entirely above suspicion, waiting patiently for blame to settle elsewhere. Chapter 7. The village settled into a quieter rhythm after the funeral arrangements were announced, though the calm felt fragile, like glass placed carefully upon a crowded table. Conversations softened whenever Harold Finch's name arose, yet curiosity lingered stubbornly beneath expressions of sympathy. St. Briarwood had accepted, almost too easily, that the missing stranger bore responsibility for tragedy, and Miss Marple sensed how comforting that belief had become for everyone involved. It was during a small morning gathering at the vicarage that the first crack appeared in that comfortable certainty. Mrs. Carter mentioned, almost absent-mindedly, that Clara Finch had taken charge of nearly every household matter since her uncle's death, accounts reviewed, papers sorted, letters answered with remarkable efficiency. So capable, Mrs. Hayward said approvingly. Such strength in difficult times. Miss Marple smiled politely, though a quiet thought stirred within her mind. True grief often slowed people. Efficiency required emotional distance. She asked gently whether Clara had always assisted with her uncle's business affairs. "Oh, no," Mrs. Hayward replied. "Mr. Finch kept such matters private." A small but important inconsistency. If Clara had not previously handled documents, her sudden familiarity with them suggested urgency rather than duty. Later that morning, Miss Marple walked past Finch House and noticed Clara speaking with the solicitor near the garden gate. The young woman's posture appeared composed, yet her voice carried a faint sharpness when she believed herself unheard. "I want everything settled quickly," Clara insisted. "There is no reason to delay." The solicitor murmured something calming, but Clara's impatience lingered even after he departed. Miss Marple continued walking, reflecting that haste often accompanied fear, particularly fear of discovery. At the bakery, fresh gossip awaited her. The maid from Finch House had mentioned that Miss Clara spent the afternoon before the death alone in the study while her uncle attended meetings. She had been searching drawers, organizing files, and burning old papers in the fireplace. Burning papers during ordinary housekeeping struck Miss Marple as unusual. Important papers disappeared most easily under the appearance of tidying. As she carried her purchases home, Miss Marple considered another detail that had troubled her quietly: the broken clock found beside Finch's body. Clocks rarely stop precisely unless damaged intentionally. A fall might disturb one, certainly, but the position described suggested placement rather than accident. Someone had wanted time recorded, or misrecorded. That afternoon, she visited Clara under the gentle pretense of offering companionship. The young woman received her graciously in the drawing room, sunlight falling across carefully arranged flowers. Everything appeared orderly, too orderly for a household recently shaken by tragedy. "You are very kind to visit," Clara said, her smile polite but measured. Miss Marple observed how Clara poured tea without spilling a single drop, her hands perfectly steady. Not the trembling grief Miss Marple had seen in countless bereaved relatives over the years. They spoke of ordinary matters at first: weather, visitors, funeral arrangements, until Miss Marple allowed a quiet pause to settle between them. "Your uncle must have trusted you greatly," she said gently, "to allow you access to his papers." Clara hesitated only briefly. "I wish to help him organize matters." Her tone sharpened slightly at the word organize. Miss Marple noticed faint traces of ink again along Clara's fingers, darker than before despite repeated washing. Writing frequently. Perhaps forging. She allowed the conversation to drift elsewhere, speaking warmly of village life while observing small reactions. When the stranger's disappearance was mentioned casually, Clara's composure changed almost imperceptibly. Her smile tightened, and she reached quickly for her teacup, though it remained nearly full. Relief mixed with anxiety, an odd combination. Such a dreadful man, Clara said quickly. Running away like that. Miss Marple tilted her head gently. Fear makes people run. Clara's eyes flickered upward, searching Miss Marple's face as though measuring how much she understood. Yes, she said after a moment. Fear. The word lingered heavily between them. While leaving, Miss Marple paused briefly near the study door, pretending to admire a painting. She noticed the window latch again, loose enough that it could be opened easily from inside and later presented as forced entry. A staged struggle became increasingly plausible. Outside, she encountered the maid, who mentioned innocently that Miss Clara alone knew about the faulty latch because she had complained about drafts weeks earlier. Knowledge of entry points. Opportunity. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly at home, reviewing events with careful patience. The stranger, Edward Hale's son, had gathered evidence of financial wrongdoing. Finch, fearing exposure, argued with him. Clara, discovering the investigation, realized her inheritance stood at risk. Desperation followed. She imagined the scene gently, not as accusation, but understanding. Clara confronting her uncle, demanding reassurance. Voices rising. Panic in a confined space. A sudden push rather than planned violence. Accident becoming opportunity. The broken clock placed deliberately. Papers scattered to suggest struggle, window open for appearance, and finally, blame directed toward the outsider already under suspicion. Miss Marple poured tea slowly, the pieces aligning with quiet certainty. One final detail troubled her still: the forged letters. She remembered the ink stains and Clara's haste to answer correspondence. Perhaps letters had been altered to frame the stranger, strengthening suspicion against him. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Carter arrived breathless with new gossip. They found letters in Mr. Finch's desk, she whispered. Threatening ones. Signed only with initials. Everyone says they must belong to the stranger. Miss Marple listened carefully. Were they handwritten? She asked. Yes, though rather elegant writing for a man traveling so roughly. Elegant writing. Clara's handwriting, Miss Marple recalled, possessed precisely that refined quality. After her visitor departed, Miss Marple felt the final certainty settle within her mind. The mystery no longer felt tangled. It felt inevitable. The stranger had been framed using evidence crafted carefully within the household itself, and Clara's growing insistence upon his guilt revealed not confidence, but fear that doubt might arise. Night deepened outside, village lamps glowing softly through mist. Miss Marple folded her hands and allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. Truth in villages rarely emerged through grand revelations. It appeared through teaspoons placed slightly wrong, ink stains unnoticed, and emotions expressed half a second too late. Tomorrow, she decided, would require gentle conversation in the presence of witnesses. Not accusation. Explanation. For people accepted truth more easily when guided calmly toward it. As she extinguished the lamp, one final realization settled warmly yet ominously within her thoughts. The running guest had never been escaping guilt. He had been escaping danger. And the real killer, certain of her own cleverness, was already beginning to believe she had succeeded, unaware that Miss Marple had quietly followed every small detail leading straight to her door. Chapter 8. The morning of the gathering dawned calm and pale, as though St. Briarwood itself wished to appear innocent again after days of quiet unrest. Word had spread gently, carried through polite invitations rather than announcements, that the vicar would host a small meeting at Finch House to settle certain misunderstandings surrounding Harold Finch's death. Villagers accepted such invitations readily. Curiosity, after all, was strongest when wrapped in propriety. Miss Marple arrived precisely on time, her manner serene, her expression kindly as ever. The drawing room filled gradually with familiar faces. Mrs. Hayward, Mrs. Carter, the solicitor, the vicar and his wife, and finally Clara Finch herself, dressed in soft morning black. She greeted everyone with composed gratitude, though Miss Marple noticed the faint tension at the corners of her smile. Outside, sunlight filtered through thin clouds, illuminating dust motes drifting lazily in the air. It was an ordinary village morning, almost peaceful enough to convince one that tragedy had already passed. Almost. The vicar cleared his throat gently. Miss Marple believes she may clarify certain confusions, he said kindly. All eyes turned toward her. Miss Marple folded her hands comfortably in her lap before speaking, her voice warm and conversational, as though recounting a small anecdote rather than addressing a matter of life and death. It seems to me, she began softly, that St. Briarwood has recently welcomed not one mystery, but two. A stranger who arrived with questions, and a tragedy that followed before those questions could be answered. She glanced around the room, ensuring no one felt accused. Our visitor, who used more than one name, was widely believed to be hiding something. In truth, he was searching for something. Clara shifted slightly in her chair. Miss Marple continued gently. Many years ago, Harold Finch had a business partner, Edward Hale. The partnership ended badly, and Mr. Hale disappeared in disgrace. Yet certain payments made quietly over many years suggest Mr. Finch carried guilt or obligation connected to that past. The solicitor nodded slowly, confirming the existence of those payments. The stranger, Miss Marple said, was Edward Hale's son. He came not for revenge, but for proof. He gathered information carefully, wrote letters, and prepared evidence in case anything prevented him from finishing his work. A murmur moved through the room. He confronted Mr. Finch, she continued. Not violently, but truthfully. And someone else realized that this truth threatened far more than reputation. Her gaze rested briefly, kindly, upon Clara. The inheritance, Miss Marple said softly, depended upon Mr. Finch's respectability. Exposure of past wrongdoing or present financial irregularities would have changed everything. Clara's composure tightened. Surely you are not suggesting. Miss Marple raised a gentle hand, only explaining what small details have shown. She spoke calmly, never raising her voice. On the afternoon of Mr. Finch's death, Miss Clara had access to the study and knowledge of its window latch. She had been organizing papers and burning some earlier that day. Ink stains upon her fingers revealed hurried writing, and letters later discovered blaming the stranger were written in a refined hand inconsistent with his habits. Clara's face paled. The stranger ran, Miss Marple continued kindly, because he had already uncovered evidence and feared being accused after an argument. Witnesses saw him leaving before the clock stopped at 20 minutes past 4. She paused, allowing the fact to settle. The clock, she added gently, was placed deliberately to establish a false time of death. A fall alone would not have stopped it so precisely. Silence filled the room. Miss Marple's tone softened further. I believe Miss Clara confronted her uncle after realizing the investigation would expose financial matters, including funds she herself had quietly taken. The argument grew heated. A push, perhaps unintended, caused Mr. Finch to fall fatally. Clara rose suddenly. That is absurd, but her voice trembled now. Miss Marple regarded her with compassion rather than accusation. Panic often follows accidents. The window was open to suggest intrusion. Papers scattered. Letters forged to direct suspicion toward the stranger already viewed with distrust. The young woman's hands shook visibly. You cannot prove. At that moment, the solicitor spoke quietly. The handwriting comparison, it does match Miss Clara's correspondence. The words landed gently, but decisively. Clara's composure collapsed. She sank back into her chair, eyes filling at last with tears that had refused to come before. I didn't mean, she whispered. He wouldn't listen. Everything was going to be taken away. No one spoke. Miss Marple's expression remained kind, almost sorrowful. Desperation, she said softly, makes ordinary people do extraordinary things. But truth has a way of waiting patiently. Clara covered her face, confession arriving in broken sentences. She admitted confronting her uncle, pushing him during the argument, then realizing what she had done. Fear guided every decision afterward. The staged scene, the forged letters, the convenient blame placed upon the outsider. When the police arrived quietly to escort her away, the villagers watched in stunned silence. Sympathy lingered alongside shock. Clara had been familiar, trusted, part of their daily lives. Afterward, the room remained still for several moments. Mrs. Carter finally whispered, "And the stranger?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Safe, I believe." His letters ensured the truth would eventually reach the proper authorities. He ran not from guilt, but from danger. The vicar nodded thoughtfully, relief softening his expression. Outside, the bells of St. Briarwood began to ring the hour, their sound warm and steady, restoring rhythm to a village unsettled by hidden darkness. Miss Marple rose quietly and prepared to leave. The sunlight outside felt brighter now, the air clearer, as though tension itself had lifted. Walking slowly along the lane, she reflected upon how easily appearances misled even the kindest communities. Villages cherished familiarity, yet familiarity sometimes blinded people to uncomfortable truths. The stranger had arrived carrying the past. Clara had tried desperately to outrun the future, and between them stood the quiet certainty that human nature rarely changed. Fear, pride, and hope weaving together until one careless moment altered everything. She paused near the green, watching children play as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Life resumed quickly in villages. Routines healed what shock disturbed. Miss Marple allowed herself a gentle smile. Truth, she thought, behaved very much like an unexpected guest. It might be delayed, misunderstood, or even forced away for a time. But sooner or later, it always returned and knocked politely at the door. And as she continued home beneath the soft afternoon light, Miss Marple felt certain that St. Briarwood would remember this lesson quietly, speaking of it only in lowered voices over tea. For the guest who ran had never truly escaped. He had merely carried truth into the village, and left it there, waiting patiently until someone noticed the smallest, simplest details that revealed everything at last. The days that followed returned St. Briarwood slowly to its familiar rhythm, though a thoughtful quiet lingered beneath ordinary conversation. Curtains opened again, gardens were tended, and the church bells rang with comforting regularity, yet people spoke more gently than before, as if aware that even the most peaceful village could hide complicated hearts behind polite smiles. News arrived a week later confirming that Edward Hale's son had come forward safely after learning the truth had been uncovered. His letters, carefully sent beyond the village, had reached authorities exactly as he intended. They contained documents proving the old financial deception that had ruined his father many years earlier. Though justice could never fully repair the past, the truth had at last been spoken aloud, and with it came a quiet sense of balance restored. Miss Marple received the news without surprise. She sat by her window that afternoon, sunlight warming the small table beside her, reflecting upon how often misunderstandings shape people's judgments. The village had feared the stranger because he was unknown, because he asked questions, because he did not belong. Yet it was familiarity, not strangeness, that had concealed the real danger. Clara Finch's departure saddened many. Even those who understood her actions spoke of her with sympathy rather than anger. Desperation, Miss Marple believed, rarely began with wickedness. It began with fear. Fear of loss, of shame, of a future suddenly uncertain. The tragedy lay not only in Harold Finch's death, but in the long chain of secrets and silence that made such a moment possible. At the vicarage tea gathering the following Sunday, conversation cautiously returned to ordinary matters. Mrs. Carter remarked that the village felt calmer again, though she admitted she now looked more carefully at people's expressions. One never truly knows what burdens others carry. she said thoughtfully. Miss Marple agreed with a gentle smile. Observation, she often felt, was simply kindness practiced patiently. Outside, children chased one another across the green, their laughter bright and unaffected. Life continued as it always did, folding sorrow into memory and memory into story. Already the events surrounding the stranger were becoming something retold in softer tones, a mystery solved, a lesson quietly learned. That evening, Miss Marple walked home beneath a sky brushed with gold and lavender. Rosebank Cottage stood peaceful once more, its windows open to the fresh air. Another guest would arrive someday, another story would begin, and the village would welcome it with the same mixture of curiosity and caution. She paused briefly at the gate, listening to the distant bells marking the hour. Truth, she reflected, rarely announced itself loudly. It appeared in small inconsistencies, unnoticed gestures, and words spoken half a moment too quickly. One simply had to notice. With a contented sigh, she continued along the lane, certain that St. Briarwood would remain what it had always been, a place of kindness, gossip, and quiet observation, where even the deepest secrets could not remain hidden forever. And somewhere beyond the village, a guest who once ran carried peace at last, knowing that patience and one observant mind had allowed truth to find its way home.